Thank you so much for coming out and filling up the lecture hall. It's great to see so many people are interested in this very important topic, and it's such a delight to have you here with us. I'm going to take my seat and then let you know who I am and what's going on. Very quickly, I just want to say I am Professor Stephen Collis. I am a law professor here at UT Austin and the faculty director of the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center. We are sponsoring today's event. I also want to thank all of our co-sponsors. As you can see from the banners behind me, we have many. The Clements Center for National Security, UT Austin's Civitas Institute, the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and UT Austin's School of Civic Leadership. We are grateful for all of them for making today possible. And please filter in as best you can. I know we're close to being at standing room only. There do seem to be a few seats up in the front if you're brave enough to want to walk all the way up here in front of everybody and sit down. What I'm going to do today is going to be as conversational as we can possibly make it. Each of our speakers is going to talk for really just about 5 minutes. And I'm going to try to hold you to that, professors. Professors are the worst at sticking to time limits. We are going to try to, each person will speak for about 5 minutes and then have a dialogue with each other, a moderated conversation, but we want to leave ample time. In fact, I think the bulk of the meeting for questions from all of you. So we will have people who are running mics. One of our speakers, as you can tell, has joined us from over Zoom today. So please wait till you have a mic in hand to speak so that he can hear what you have to say. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers and then get out of the way. Our first speaker today is Professor Juan Miguel Matheus. He is a professor of political and constitutional theory at Universidad Monteavila in Caracas, Venezuela. He is actually here as a scholar in exile from the Maduro regime, as a Bowden scholar in residence with us at the First Amendment Center. He obtained his PhD in constitutional law from the University of Navarro in Spain and has been a visiting professor at several universities across Iberoamerica. He is also an affiliate at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School. In 2015, he was elected as deputy to the National Assembly of Venezuela, where he served as president of the Committee for the Defense of the Constitution and the Committee for the Reform of the Judiciary. And I will tell you, I first met Professor Matheus when he and I were together at Stanford. He had been smuggled out of Venezuela so he could come to the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford to draft an alternative constitution for his country if the Maduro regime should ever fall. Professor Diego Zambrano is a professor of law at Stanford Law School. He is joining us remotely. Wave, Diego, can you hear us okay? Great. I want you to know that Professor Zambrano was more than willing to come here in person today, but given how quickly we put this event together in less than 6 days, it would have required him to fly in the morning, fly out immediately after, and he still would have been about 15 minutes late. So we decided having him join over Zoom was better. His primary research and teaching interests lie in the areas of civil procedure and comparative law, but he also has an interest in comparative constitutional law and legal developments related to Latin America. Professor Zambrano is the Associate Dean for Global Programs and Faculty Director of the Newcomb Center for the Rule of Law at Stanford. He has written and spoken much about the situation in Venezuela, including in his related article in the Chicago Law Review, Foreign Dictators in U.S. Courts. And I think this probably goes without saying, but I'm going to be shortening all of these people's accomplishments down to the bare minimum here. So obviously they've done far more than what I can possibly read right now. Professor Kurt Weyland is the Mike Hogue Professor in Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. His research interests focus on democratization and authoritarian rule, on social policy and policy diffusion, and on populism in Latin America and Europe. He has drawn on a range of theoretical and methodological approaches, including insights from cognitive psychology, and has done extensive field research in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, and Venezuela. He is the author of numerous books and articles directly related to our topic today, including the book, The Politics of Market Reform in Fragile Democracies, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela. Please join me in welcoming our guests, and then we'll let Professor Matheus take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Collis and the First Amendment Center to make possible this conversation. And thank you to all of you for being here, interested in Venezuelan issues and democratic issues in general. I have to be brief, and let me start by saying that Nicolás Maduro was removed from Venezuela. So I want to start by asking you to raise your hand if you think that a use of force was justified in Venezuela. Okay. Raise your hand if you are not in favor of that, please. I think it's in everything. No, it's more or less, yeah. Okay. So recent public opinion surveys say that 85% of Venezuelans agree with that measure from the government of the United States to extract and remove Maduro from Venezuela. Of course, I'm a Venezuelan, and I'm a Venezuelan politician. I think, and this is my first statement here to provoke you, that the legitimate use of force was justified in Venezuela. But right now, I'm pretty much concerned because of the development of the possible transition who is taking place in Venezuela. And the state of art is this. So Maduro was extracted from Venezuela. Then we have the remnant, we have a part of the regime, the apparatus of the regime, being empowered with Delcy Rodriguez heading that part of the regime. And we have a tutelage justified in oil and order reasons of the United States over Venezuela. And then the opposition, the democratic opposition of Venezuela, is marginalized from this process. So this is a unique situation for political transition. Actually, I think that the democratic liberalization started partially in Venezuela, but we don't know where are we going right now. And we have to do things pretty well to go to a real democratization in my country. So what are the challenges of the democratic opposition? Right now, in this very moment, Maria Corina Machado, the leader of the democratic opposition of Venezuela, is having lunch with President Trump in the White House. It's a closed doors meeting. I think that we all know what they talk about, but they are having that lunch, and that is good news. But we have many challenges with this situation. The first challenge is the Constitution. We Venezuelans have to fulfill our Constitution. Even in this facto situation, we have to face Delcy Rodriguez and the regime, and also we have to face the pretension of the tutelage from the United States with the Constitution in terms of sovereignty. Then we have the challenge to have elections, because we have to resolve the problem in terms of popular sovereignty. So Delcy Rodriguez right now is the acting president of Venezuela from January, from last week. So she has 90 days to be the acting president of Venezuela, plus more 19 days, and then the regime has to call to election according to the Constitution. I don't know if that will happen, but we have to ask for it. Then the third challenge to me is the time limits, the influence of the United States. And we are grateful with the United States, but the influence of the United States should have a limitation in terms of time. A year and a half, 2 years, we don't know, but we need some limits. Then human rights. We have a country with massive violation of human rights. People in jail, people tortured, people in exile, like me, people killed, 9 million of people running away from the country. And if we are thinking in a real democratization, we need human rights. And that means, to me, the presence of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Venezuela and the High Office for Human Rights of the United Nations. And then, and that is the final challenge that I see right now that we have to face, is this one. Venezuela is an occupied country, and not by the United States. It's an occupied country by the Russians, by Iran, and the Cubans. And we have to take advantage of this situation to expel all of them from Venezuela to recover the territorial sovereignty of my country. And we also have to defeat the terrorism, the Islamic fundamentalism, and the organized crime, specifically drug trafficking. I think they are the challenges. We have to wait for the result of the meeting, Maria Corina Machado and President Trump meeting today, but we have a moral orientation, which means constitution and elections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Matheus. Now I think our second speaker will be Professor Zambrano from Stanford. So Diego, hopefully the Zoom link works and the mic works as you get going here. Go ahead. We can't hear you at all.
You cannot hear me.
Oh, now we can hear you. There we go. All right,
okay,
good.
Great.
Good.
All right. So it's great to be here, and I know that during the Q&A we're going to get into the details of Venezuela, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Before we do that, I wanted to touch on three topics that are more general about U.S. law, international law, and then the U.S. role in Latin America. So I want to address the legality of the strikes, because I still think there's a lot of confusion about this under domestic law. The second, the legality of the strike under international law, and an argument that I've been making about that. And finally, as I said, the role of the U.S. in Latin America, and why I'm reasonably optimistic about Venezuela. And by the way, as a Venezuelan, I'm also happy about what happened. I support the U.S. operation. So first, the legality of the strike under domestic law. So the question is whether the president has unilateral authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, his commander-in-chief power, to deploy the armed forces in a foreign country like this without congressional approval. This is not the kind of thing that you litigate about. It doesn't end up in court, partly because no party has standing to challenge this. Another reason is that courts have avoided this kind of political dispute. And so it's all about the relationship between Congress and the president. And there's a direct precedent for this, which is the invasion of Panama in 1989. President George H.W. Bush ordered the deployment of tens of thousands of Marines to remove the dictator of Panama, Noriega. President Bush did not consult with Congress before doing that. And like in Venezuela, the U.S. seized the acting dictator and brought him to the U.S. for a prosecution. So it's almost a direct, exact precedent. And I could talk about some potential distinctions. But at the time, the Office of Legal Counsel of the White House argued that this was a law enforcement operation. That under Article 2, the president has the power to seize and indict a criminal, even if they're abroad, even if they call themselves the president of a country. But we don't recognize them as the president of a country. We didn't recognize Noriega, we did not recognize Maduro. And so Congress was not in session at the time that the Panama invasion happened. But when they came back into session, the House of Representatives passed a resolution praising the action. This is in line with 100 years of precedent where Congress has acquiesced to this kind of thing. It's not a limitless power, but I do think there's a very good argument that under all these precedents, the president has the power to do this. Okay, second, under international law, there's an international prohibition on the use of force. It's in the UN Charter. It's pretty absolute. The only exception is self-defense. There's no good argument here that that wasn't violated. In other words, that was violated in this case. But this prohibition is also routinely violated. Consider, for instance, President Clinton's bombing of Kosovo to stop Serbian forces there. The Clinton administration admitted that this was a violation of international law, but they said that it was the right thing to do. And in fact, if you think about it, we don't necessarily care about whether it was violated, but why it was violated. And the current framework doesn't differentiate between, say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or maybe China's future invasion of Taiwan, and an invasion like this. And I think international law should evolve. I think it's very important to draw distinctions based on what the population of the country wants and what the legitimately elected leaders want. Ukrainians don't want the Russians invading. And by the way, they don't want Russians annexing territory, which is a different prohibition. Taiwanese do not want the Chinese to invade. Venezuelans wanted this. As Juan Miguel mentioned, polls show vast majority supporting this military operation. And so Venezuelans welcome this. The legitimately elected leaders like Edmundo González, Maria Corina Machado invited this. And that makes all the difference to me morally. International law doesn't recognize this, but it should. And I'll mention another twisted aspect of international law, which is that if you think about Syria, the Syrian dictator Assad invited Russian troops into Syria to massacre the Syrian people. International law had nothing to say about that. The Venezuelan dictatorship has invited a Cuban military and intelligence invasion for over 20 years. International law had nothing to say about that. And we have tons of evidence that the Cubans invaded. It was an invited invasion, but they invaded. They also stole our oil, by the way, for more than 20 years. International law didn't care about that. But it does seem to care about an invited intervention to remove a dictator. And I think that's twisted. And we have to have a better conversation about this. I'm at 5 minutes. I'll just briefly mention that the role of the United States in Latin America and why I'm optimistic has really changed after the Cold War. When people think about U.S. interventions in Latin America, they're mostly thinking about Cold War era coups or Pinochet in Chile, CIA-backed operations. But when you look at what the U.S. has done after 1989, you have the invasion of Panama, which was wildly successful. Panama is now one of the richest countries in Latin America with a GDP per capita over $30,000. They have a really stable democracy. It's flourishing. If you look at Plan Colombia in Colombia, even closer to Venezuela, where the U.S. militarily helped Colombia defeat the guerrillas, stabilized the country, turned it from a failed state into a democracy, wildly successful. If you look at even non-military, quote-unquote, interventions, like Peru after the dictatorship of Fujimori, the U.S. tripled financial aid into Peru, signed a free trade agreement with Peru. Peru stabilized, it's a democracy, it's wobbly, there are problems. But the U.S. has been really good for Latin America after 1989. And I'm happy to defend that, and it makes me optimistic about what can happen in Venezuela. And I'll just conclude by saying lots of reasons to think that countries revert to the mean. After a dictatorship like this, they go back to the thing that was there before. And if you had no good government, as Afghanistan did, you go back into a Taliban-managed anarchy. If you had sectarian violence like Iraq did, you go back to that. Venezuela had a stable democracy. It has a really strong diaspora. It makes me optimistic. But we'll get into the details. I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor Zambrano and Professor Weyland. You're up. Try to stick within that 5 to 7 minute range if you can.
So I have the unpleasant professional task to talk to you in the spirit of unwishful thinking, wishless thinking, and to have a much more pessimistic take on the prospects of Venezuela, especially in terms of democracy. And you see in Panama, Grenada, the US invasion in the 1980s did lead to democracy. I think that is unlikely in Venezuela. And one of the main reasons is that Donald Trump really wouldn't want to have the risk of a serious regime transition in Venezuela. When you think about it, Donald Trump does not want to get the United States involved in the quagmire of conflict, of domestic trouble and turmoil, which is very much what a transition in Venezuela could potentially risk. And so you see that the new semi-colonial overlord of Venezuela has no interest in actually promoting or allowing for a democratic transition in the country. And I think that is very important. You see this very strange pact of Donald Trump, the right-wing imperialist, with the left-wing anti-imperialists in Venezuela. He has been quite happy to cooperate with the established power structure. He just took out Maduro, but the rest of the whole power cartel persists in Venezuela, and that in many ways guarantees the stability that Donald Trump craves and allows, if he pushes them hard enough to get some oil out, so he can tell his MAGA base, this was worth it. But what he clearly wants to avoid is the trouble and turmoil of a democratic transition. And that is, the trouble and turmoil, I think, would be a high risk of emerging because that power structure that hangs on, the Rodriguez's, Diosdado Cabello, Padrino, the whole crowd, they, of course, are firmly entrenched. They have a very strong interest in defending their access to rents, their involvement in corruption, contraband, all kinds of illegal activities. And so they don't want to lose this. They will fight tooth and nail to maintain it. And what is even more important is the following. They are fearful. A democratic transition could potentially expose them to prosecution and retribution for all the violations of human rights, for all the repression, for all the corruption, for all the contraband, for all the bad things that they have already done. So a democratic transition for them poses a big threat. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that the democratic opposition couldn't credibly, reliably commit to giving them an amnesty and letting them off scot-free, because you might promise all kinds of things before you have power, and when you have power, you can renege on it. And of course, amnesties in Latin America are not firm, right? The Argentine case, there was a pardon, there was an amnesty, then comes Nestor Kirchner and said, now we're going to go after the human rights violators anyway. And of course, anybody who has committed human rights violations will know this, and anybody who has done that will be concerned. If we lose power, we might end up in the prison cell next to Maduro. We might end up hauled in by the International Criminal Court. Donald Trump couldn't just pardon the whole crowd because there are indictments from the International Criminal Court, and they have to be fearful. If they lose power, they end up locked up forever. And so that is a very strong incentive for them to cling to power as much as they can. Now, according to the Constitution, it seems that they would have to convoke elections, but institutions are weak. You can easily manipulate, you can convoke a new constituent assembly that overrides the existing constitution. You can have all kinds of tricks. So that what Juan Miguel invoked, the constitutional provision that elections would have to be called, which would be their opportunity for the opposition to push for a regime change, I think that is uncertain. Even if elections were called, the interim government would oversee them, make the rules, be able to change the electoral rules, the voting registry, all kinds of ways how they have falsified, how they have distorted, how have stolen elections along the way. So even if elections were held, it's not sure that the opposition would actually win, despite the massive popular support they have. The other problem is that the Venezuelan opposition continues to be divided. There's Maria Corina Machado, whose handpicked candidate won the election in 2024 in a landslide, but there are also other opposition forces like Enrique Capriles, who broke with the opposition, accepted a position in the current legislature. The Chavistas could easily foment that division in the opposition and try and hope that their remaining vote support, supported by a government that is in power, that can push and shove, would actually, in an unlikely way, give them a victory in any democratic or any election that would be held. And so, unfortunately, against my own wishes, I am forced to be very skeptical. I think it is unlikely. Donald Trump doesn't want it. The established power structure doesn't want it to have this crazy but logical agreement in keeping Venezuela stable. The opposition is divided. Institutions are weak, can easily be distorted. There are so many potential difficulties and obstacles that I think are in the way of a democratic transition in Venezuela that unfortunately I fear that, contrary to Grenada, where US invasion brought democracy, contrary to Panama, where US invasion brought democracy, Donald Trump has no interest in that. Even Marco Rubio, I think, was partly behind that, who has a regime change agenda, but that is focused on Cuba and not directly on Venezuela. And so, as I say, I'm sorry in terms of my own preferences to tell you that as a political scientist, I have to conclude that unfortunately a democratic transition in Venezuela is unlikely, but I hope I will be proven wrong. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all three of you. For me, the two most salient questions that the three of you raised were about the legality of the United States' actions, but then also, what is the effect going to be? And so let's start with your pessimistic take, and I'd love either Juan Miguel or Diego to address this. He's very concerned that this is basically going to get oil and nothing else and not actually resolve any of the real on-the-ground problems, and I'd love to hear what you think in response.
So there's a dichotomous way to think about things, which is a democratic transition versus the status quo, but I don't think that we should think about it that way. way. There's a spectrum of possibilities here. One, I think we would all acknowledge, before the military operation, there was almost a 0% likelihood of a transition to democracy. That number is non-zero now. That's a good thing. I think we should all agree that's a good thing. If there is a possibility of a transition, that justifies the military operation, even if it doesn't end up happening. So that's one. Second, even if the regime stays in place, we have every reason to think that the regime would be potentially more committed to growth, especially working with the United States. So GDP per capita is going to be higher next year than it would have been without this military operation. That's a good thing. So if you think about those two alternatives, the country's better off, the military operation is morally justified, and I think it should happen. I'll add, if Donald Trump, and I know he says this repeatedly, he's mostly interested in the oil. As I mentioned, the status quo ex ante was that hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil from Venezuela were going for free to Cuba, as they were for over 20 years. We were colonized by Cuba. Suppose the worst thing happens. The United States is now taking a cut on the oil. That's a better world than it was before the military operation. We were also sending hundreds of thousands of barrels to China under heavy discounts. That wouldn't happen anymore. That's a better world. Everything I just painted tells me morally there's a better world now than before the military operation. There is some likelihood of a transition. I completely agree that there are lots of potential difficulties, and I completely agree that unlike the transitions of the 80s, where the military arguably could go back to the barracks because they're an institution, these are criminals. The criminals can't go back. And I completely agree that changes things. So that does make me pessimistic. It's just a matter of percentages here.
Juan Miguel, your thoughts on this?
I think that Professor Weyland is not pessimistic, but realistic. Okay? We have to struggle a lot to achieve the real democratization of the country. But as Professor Zambrano said, we are in a much better position right now to try to get democracy for the country. First of all, because Maduro is not in the picture. Second, because Cubans, Russians, and people from Iran are now threatened by the United States. Because, of course, that the United States wants the control over Venezuela, but to get the control over the Venezuelan oil means to expel Iran from Venezuela, because Iran is the main partner in the oil industry to Venezuela. And that is a good thing to us to see if in the next weeks we can have people from Iran out of the country. Then you provoke me about the opposition. And the opposition is united, the real opposition, the democratic opposition, headed by María Corina Machado and Edmundo González Urrutia. I talked to María Corina Machado this morning just to say, hello, I'm supporting you because you're going to see President Trump. And we're united. But, of course, there's a fake opposition in the country. The regime tailored a fake opposition, and the head of that fake opposition is Enrique Capriles, a former presidential candidate. He used to be part of my political party, but he decided to go to the regime, and he was elected with no vote, without vote, to the National Assembly of the regime. So I think that is important to distinguish what is real opposition and what is fake opposition. And then there is an important matter here for the possibilities of the democratization. And that is that the military, the Venezuelan military doesn't exist. That's impressive, but it doesn't exist. There was a myth. The extraction of Maduro and nothing happened, nobody resists in the country, means that there is not a military in Venezuela. That's right. Okay, so are they important for the democratic transition? Yeah, but potentially. Right now, they don't have a role. And the most important people to play a role here is Diosdado Cabello, who is the Interior Secretary of Venezuela. He's the one in charge of the repression machinery of the regime. And of course, he has a lot of pressure from the United States. Secretary of State Rubio have mentioned Diosdado Cabello, and he's under threat. But then, I go back to the beginning. I think that you are not pessimistic, you are realistic, and we have to get the job done. We have to finish the job, but as Diego mentioned, I think that we are doing it much better right now.
Anything you'd like to say in response, Professor Weyland?
The only thing I want to say is this. I completely agree the removal of Maduro was necessary for any possibility of a democratic transition in Venezuela. And unfortunately, it was only an external military intervention that could have gotten rid of Maduro and that could potentially have shaken. That regime was so entrenched. Maduro, despite his awful performance, managed to stay in power for 13 years, avoid all kinds of domestic threats. So only the US could have taken the man out. Completely agree with it. Necessary condition, but far from sufficient. Far from sufficient. And
I agree.
The Venezuelan military doesn't exist internationally, but don't they have 2,400 generals? The Venezuelan army has 2,400 generals, probably more than the whole rest of the world combined, and they all have their fingers.
They're fake generals.
They all have their fingers in rents, contraband, drug trafficking. A lot of them have committed repression. They have a big stake in not shaking up things in Venezuela. And so while they can't shoot at an American helicopter, they can shoot at their compatriots. And they have the colectivos. And that is a huge, huge obstacle to any real democratic transition in Venezuela. And so, agreed. It was a necessary step. Unfortunately, I hate to believe that because I hope you're right. I think the likelihood of a democratic transition is rather low.
So I'm gonna do a two-step move here. Can we make sure our mic runners are ready to go? Because I'm gonna pivot over to giving the audience the time to ask questions in just a second. So you guys get ready. And then Diego, let me throw something back at you while the mic runners are getting ready. You mentioned about the interpretation of Article 2 and Noriega. I'd love for you, if you could, to address what methodology was used to decide that Article 2 might allow this. Was there a methodology? We often, for those of you who aren't law students, we often talk about different ways of interpreting the Constitution. What methodology was used? And if you would, maybe lay out the most sophisticated argument against your position on this, if you don't mind. What does the other side say? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because actually originalism might take you a different way than if you care about historical gloss, for instance. So a lot of the justification and the larger arguments, not necessarily in the Barr memo, which itself is controversial, rely on the historical practice, the fact that presidents have been doing this for over 100 years. And in the early 20th century, routinely the US intervened in Latin America and Congress acquiesced every time. If you care about historical practice, you might say, hey, that seems determinative, right? If you're an originalist, you might be willing to just start with the text and the original meaning of the original public meaning of Article 1, the fact that Congress has the power to declare war. And it seems like this is more than just bombing. This is actually sending troops to seize a foreign head of state. I think there's a plausible argument there from an originalist angle that Congress should be in charge of this kind of move. I also think a good counter-argument, there's a couple. One, even if we care about historical practice, the War Powers Act, which was adopted in the 1970s, maybe changed things. That was Congress reasserting its Article 1 power to declare war. Lots of controversies over the meaning of the War Powers Act. But even if you think that is true, Congress isn't enacting war powers resolutions after these interventions. So I don't know how seriously to take it. I had a great conversation with Steve Black, who I know is a former professor at UT Austin. And he argues that there were two other elements in Panama. One is that a Marine was killed in Panama, and the Panamanian legislature had declared a state of war against the US. You might take that seriously to mean that the US, the president, had what is recognized from an original public meaning, the ability to unilaterally repel an invasion or protect U.S. forces. So if you kill a Marine, now the president has the ability to protect U.S. forces by ordering an invasion. That's a plausible argument. That didn't happen in Venezuela. So I think that's a plausible counterargument. I still think Jack Goldsmith's view, which is that the Barr memo pretty easily justifies this and historical practice matters, is a better argument. But hey, Congress should reassert its authority if it truly believes that it has the Article 1 power of declaring war. And it didn't. You just saw a vote fail yesterday in the Senate. And so I think that's acquiescence again.
All right, thank you so much. Let's turn now to the audience and open it up for questions. I want to encourage people, we're not inviting you to grandstand. We're inviting you to ask questions so we can have our experts continue to offer dialogue. So why don't we go right there? I will prioritize people that seem to me to be students, so don't be offended if you're not, don't look like a student and I don't call on you. Go ahead.
So I'm Jay Spale, I'm a law student. I was wondering if Machado was democratically elected in only 2024. I assume her original term she was elected for wouldn't have expired yet. Why does there need to be a new election? Why not just reinstate her and say that like she's still in her first term from that election?
Well, one political problem is that she couldn't run, and the person elected is Edmundo Gonzalez, who I think completely lacks the political skills of overseeing a transition. He was a figurehead for her. So the opposition in many ways wouldn't want him to be the president, right? Because I think he would have had a very hard time having governability. And I think it would be much more legitimacy if you hold a new election and then you win, rather than you would depend so much on Donald Trump. You know, the election a year and a half ago didn't lead to your inauguration. It was only Donald Trump. You want to have, in a conflictual, contentious situation like contemporary Venezuela, you want to have real democratic legitimacy with your own electoral mandate for a politician who has the skills to actually govern.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Maria Corina Machado is the real leader of the country. She couldn't run because she was disqualified for 2024 election, but she won the primaries back in 2023 with 95% of the votes. So she's the real leader. And my personal opinion is that she's going to be the most important person in next election if we have them. And it is a problem the way in which, this is a personal opinion, but it is a real problem the way in which President Trump is becoming the source of legitimacy of the Venezuelan process. Because just yesterday he said, Delcy Rodriguez is wonderful. And she's wonderful because she's giving us all what we are asking her to give to the United States. And he said, well, he's now with Maria Corina in this meeting, but that is something that we have to pay attention, you know, to not let President Trump to be the source of legitimacy instead of the Venezuelan people.
Okay, somewhere on this side. How about the gentleman right there in the red shirt? He doesn't look like a student, but I'll give it to him. No offense if you are a student.
And I reject your profiling. Steve Gerson, not a student. Often in Donald Trump's meetings, he reacts to what the last person has said to him. Machado's clearly started out on the right foot by offering him her Nobel Prize. What do you think? What do you think she's trying to accomplish in this meeting? What do you think her strategies are, and what do you think can be accomplished?
Well, if I would be Maria Corina Machado, I think that my main goal was to tell President Trump that I am able to go back to Venezuela to fight on the ground. Because right now, we have Delcy Rodriguez as an acting president and the tutelage of the United States. But that combination is not being challenged by no one. And we need people on the ground to challenge that situation, to push for election, to ask for elections, and to mobilize people in Venezuela. Because people are afraid. But I think that soon people will be able to go to the streets again. But I think that is the main goal, to go back to Venezuela, to support free elections, to expel the dictatorial powers of the world from Venezuela, and to put limits to the tutelage.
And I just wanted to add a couple of pieces here. So one is that you should all know that, and Juan Miguel could talk about this, Delcy Rodriguez is another thug, brutal person who's been part of the regime at every step of the way. She was head of the intelligence services at a time where they were extrajudicially executing people. This is not a good person. I do think there's just a pragmatic recognition that if you put Maria Corina in power, she would just get cooed out immediately by the military. She doesn't have the control over the security services that she would need in this moment to take power. And so the administration is trying to have a managed transition where you get the current regime to agree to eventually have elections. And I think, so the previous question, why elections? I think it's, again, a recognition that the regime isn't going to accept the 2024 elections, and a new election would just confer a new source of legitimacy on Maria Corina. By the way, it wouldn't be Edmundo Gonzalez, now it could be Maria Corina, hopefully. And I will add, in response to Kurt and some of the other questions, hopefully the real person running things is Rubio. We know for a fact he's kind of a classic neocon who actually does care about democracy. It would be really strange to think that he's completely become somebody else by joining the administration. I think a long career record of being a neocon who cares about democracy makes us Venezuelans optimistic about him running things, rather than Trump comes up with other justifications for why he does what he does.
Wonderful. So right here in the red glasses, yes.
Do I look like a student?
Yeah, you get the student award.
I'm not I wasn't a student here at UT as a graduate. I graduated a couple of years ago. As a Venezuelan and dually licensed attorney, I'm going to prop Diego and Juan for what y'all are saying today. It's really accurate. Now, I do have a couple of concerns. We're mentioning democratic elections with machines that are clearly not as clean as we wanted them to. I did my dissertation, a thesis for my cybersecurity program here at UT. That's my main concern with calling democratic elections if Maria Corina were to go back to the country. And second of all, I do have concerns regarding the million Venezuelans that we have here within the United States that are being, blacklisted in immigration. The country is in a blacklist, and it's been for a couple months now. I'm supposed to apply for my citizenship, and I can, but I won't get an answer until further notice. So we're put in a really sticky situation because we have, yes, an interest of Venezuela being free, and then we have a million Venezuelans outside of the country that are being targeted, to call it somehow, by the current government. So those are my couple questions and concerns that I would love to get your take on.
Regarding the second one, you're right, there's a blacklist, but Secretary of State Marco Rubio said yesterday that now Venezuelans are out of that list, and that now we are able to ask for visas again. Remember that we are not allowed to ask for visas anymore, right? So, but he said that, I know that they are working pretty hard to reopen the American embassy in Caracas, okay? Now they have personnel there. So I think that under the tutelage, the diplomatic relationship will be normal, and the embassy will be working in Venezuela. So I think that will change. And regarding to the first one about the elections, we won the election against Maduro in 2024. The electoral system is the same, of course, but without Maduro in the picture, Maduro is not in the picture anymore. I think that if we have new elections, we are able to win. We have a problem. And the problem is that the regime could become competitive. That is a real problem, because with the release of the political prisoners, with the human rights restoration, and with the economic prosperity, the regime could be competitive. And I think that Delcy Rodriguez is trying to do so, to be competitive. And that's the reason why the regime is not talking about the 7 months for the elections. If they have to go to election, they want the election in a year and a half or 2 years because they want to compete. But I think that we can win because it's a mature people. And again, we are not challenging Delcy Rodriguez right now. But if we go to the ground and we raise the flag of elections, I think that we're going to be able to mobilize the country.
So Zach, right in front of you, to your right, in the black shirt with her hand up. Yep.
My name is Celeste, and I really appreciate all of y'all's time and input on this matter. I'm not Venezuelan, but I am Hispanic, and this still remains pretty dear to my heart just because, like, me and my family, sometimes we talk about these matters. And so, Diego, you mentioned how, and I'm also curious about everyone else's input, if they're willing, but you mentioned that international law should evolve. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, because I feel that was a brief mention, but a very powerful mention. So how do you think international law could evolve, and what will it take?
I think it's a very, very good question. And it's hard to operationalize exceptions to the use of force. The reason it's a sharp rule, and law students will recognize we design sharp rules precisely for situations like this, where you don't want anyone to be able to justify an invasion. You don't want, for instance, if you said, well, if the people of a country want it, Putin is going to argue that Ukrainian people really want to be part of Russia, and therefore his invasion is justified. But there is a consent argument, as I mentioned. If the country consents to another country's military being there, international law allows it. You could imagine we have democratically elected leaders like Edmundo González and Maria Corina, where we push them to more explicitly consent to this kind of thing. So there's a record. The reason it hasn't happened so far is that those leaders don't want to be seen as the ones that invited a foreign military force. It kind of delegitimizes them with a certain percentage of the population, so they don't do it. The legitimately elected president in Panama didn't do it in 1989, and here we don't know. As far as we can tell, there was no explicit written thing. You could imagine a broader sense of consent, where a democratically elected leader, and we do have that in Venezuela, but that's not true for many dictatorships, could consent to this kind of thing. That's one way to think about it. When I talk to a lot of my international law colleagues, they always emphasize multilateralism. Luckily, right now, most Latin American countries actually support this. The populations do. If you look at surveys in the last week, you have something like 2/3 of Latin Americans approving this. And we do have governments in Latin America who have immediately recognized Maria Corina and pushed for the opposition to take power. I think there should be a multilateral option there. But it is hard to figure out how we distinguish between democracies and authoritarian regimes. But I think we have to, because we cannot let international law shield autocratic regimes like this and actually punish democracies for doing the right thing.
So I appreciate your principled argument, but once again, to be pessimistic or realistic, I mean, as a political scientist, and you think in the current international system, authoritarian powers are ascendant, Russia and China. The United States has a leader who doesn't care about democracy. So the current situation, I think, is completely averse to any move in that direction to make distinctions between interventions on behalf of democracy rather than other ones. Many countries in the developing world, and you talk about Latin America, I mean, Brazil, whatever, they're into their sovereignty. The last thing they want is providing pretexts for external intervention. So sorry to say again, I somehow got myself into the party pooper here position. I hope you are right, but woo, I don't think so.
Okay, why don't we go right here in front?
So I am admittedly not really. I don't know a ton about the recent history of Latin America. Just in some rudimentary Googling while y'all have been talking, I was able to figure out that in Panama, while Noriega was removed in '89, they didn't actually have an internationally recognized legitimate election until 1994, which is 5 years out. And as you look at these sorts of things, it seems historically they can take a long period of time. So my question, given that background, is a full democratic transition in, the next 5 minutes or the next 6 months the proper metric against which to judge this? Or would it be something more along the lines of a substantially better situation 10 years from now that is achieved in a way where, at a reasonable cost to the United States in terms of money and lives, where the benefits to the United States in terms of drugs coming into the country and generally what I'm going to call sketchy people of the Tren de Aragua type, that sort of thing happens. And, what is the timeline on which these sorts of things should be judged?
Is it for you? So on the Panamanian case, what happened is the United States installed the person who had won the election in 1989 that was stolen by Noriega. So there was an election winner who was, had democratic legitimacy, and it was so from 1990 onward, we count Panama as democratic. It was right there and then. I think if you think about a longer time frame, then I think your point is correct that this regime currently headed by Delcy Rodriguez could recover. They could improve the economy. They could, keep eating chalk like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, not be too repressive, and might actually turn competitive, which might mean that, especially with the kind of unlevel playing field, maintaining their control over the electoral apparatus, they could forge. They're more likely to forge an electoral victory 2 or 3 years from now than 6 months from now. So the opposition wants to move quickly, because now they're discredited. Now, everybody's aware of the terrible mismanagement, the repression that exists. If 2 or 3 years go by, the situation, I think, will be much less clear-cut.
Yeah, and if you see public opinion surveys, you can see that 35% of the population think that if the regime, the Chavismo, reform from itself, they could be competitive. And I think that is what Delcy Rodriguez is trying to do, to be competitive. There is a famous anecdote from Adolfo Suarez in Spain, in the Spanish case. They have, after Franco, they had free elections in 1977. But he declared to the media in an interview, he said, we were ready for the elections in 1976. And the journalist said, and why? Why Spain didn't have elections? He said, well, because we were not competitive. We need 1 more year to be competitive, and we won the elections. So they play. If you think in Nicaragua, you mentioned Nicaragua in an email, after the negotiation between Ortega and Violeta Chamorro, I think that Ortega miscalculated because he thought that he was competitive, and he accepted the election, and he lost.
Okay, I think we have a question right to your right. Zach, in the very back, the hand was up. Oh, he's got it. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. So I just kind of had a question for, I guess, all of y'all, kind of 2 parts. So as it pertains to, I know, Diego, you were talking about the moral aspects of it and so forth. As it pertains to bringing justice to those who are part of what's known as the Cartel de los Soles, how exactly do you propose to, per se, bring justice for the people of Venezuela, as well as, prosecuting these people, rather than just sending them out to Madrid, let's say? I know that Miguel is, one thing that I've heard him talk about before is truth commissions, and like that's one way to be able to establish truth and so forth. Use NGOs, so on and so forth, to be able to establish the truth and what actually happened and so forth, and be able to use the justice system to move forward. So I was curious, what exactly on that per se moral sense that you've been emphasizing, what to do there for the, I forgot your name, the individual who's in the middle there. Given the current state in which we are in now, and I know you have your level of realism or pessimism, whatever you wish to call it, what's next? Like, from your point of view, what should we do next, given the current state of affairs?
So maybe Diego first, and then Professor Weyland second, and then we may need to wrap up.
Yeah, there'll be a good division of labor here because Juan Miguel has thought a lot more about transitional justice than I have. So we taught a class together and prepared a report on a transition in Venezuela, especially a transition of the legal system. And Juan Miguel handled the transitional justice, so he'll be able to opine on that. I'll say I focus more on the transition of the judiciary. How do you build a good judiciary after you've had 25 years of dictatorship? And it's something that we now have lots of states dealing with this problem. Eastern European states have developed lots of transitional regimes where you create a new cohort of judges to take over. But I think it's a little bit unrelated to the question, so I'm just going to let Juan Miguel talk about transitional justice.
Yeah, quickly about the True Commission. The True Commission are created to find the truth, right? We have a advantage in Venezuela, and is that Maduro miscalculate also, and he led the United Nations to come to Venezuela 3 times with something called fact-finding mission. So there is a report every year. They write a report about the situation of human rights in Venezuela. So the truth is there in that report, and also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, and also the Inter-American Commission. So True Commission will not be a problem for Venezuela because the job is very, very, very done already.
So the question was, what should the democratic opposition do to increase the chances for a transition? And I think I would see two targets of what they should do. First, I would target Marco Rubio and see whether it's true that he's one of the more neocons who wants regime change, not only in Cuba, which is clear, but whether you can persuade him that you need to have it in Venezuela in order to be able to get it in Cuba. So I think target the U.S. side of the equation, and then I think what is also very important, but has to be done in a very careful way, would be for somebody like Maria Corina Machado to go back to Venezuela and mobilize mass support for demands. Completely peaceful demonstrations. Don't let yourself get tempted into, even if there's some repression by the police in turning this into trouble, because Donald Trump wouldn't want trouble, but you mobilize so much support from the bottom up that simply this regime under US tutelage can't deny that there have to be new elections. Now, it's very risky because they might somehow or other get rid of her, or if the bottom-up pressure kind of gets out of hand, that could backfire and reinforce Donald Trump's siding with the established power structure just to have the stability. So that would be kind of, top down the US and then bottom up in Venezuela. And you have to have a lot of, what do you call that kind of sensitivity? In German, we call it feeling on the top of your fingers, Fingerspitzengefühl, that you do that right, producing that bottom-up kind of pressure for elections and a transition.
Okay, well, Professor Matheus, Professor Weyland, Professor Zambrano, thank you so much for offering your expertise today. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, thank you to all of you for coming. Please look out for further events from all of the institutions that helped make today possible. Have a good day.